I'm Dom Nicholls, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we hear about the latest Russian Black Sea Fleet ship to be sunk and take a look at how the war is viewed in Australia.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
If we give President Zelensky the tools, the Ukrainians will finish the job. Slava Ukraini!
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Tuesday, the 5th of March 2024, 2 years and 10 days since the full-scale invasion began. Today, I'm joined by Australian author and journalist Latika Bourke. And later on, David Knowles speaks with author and journalist Mark Hollingsworth. I started with the latest military updates from Ukraine. So the big news of the day is Ukrainian sea drones have sunk another Russian Black Sea Fleet patrol ship off the coast of occupied Crimea. This is coming out of Kyiv this morning. Ukraine's military intelligence agency said that a unit that called Group 13 attacked the Russian Black Sea Fleet patrol ship, the Sergei Kotov, near the Kerch Strait. It was running down the southeast of Crimea, very close to the Kerch Strait and Kerch Bridge. So in a statement, Ukraine's HUR said, as a result of a strike by Magura V5 maritime drones, the Russian ship Project 22160 Sergei Kotov sustained damage to the stern, starboard and port sides. The message also said the ship was worth about $65 million, which is of interest, but I think largely irrelevant. It doesn't really matter how much these things cost for now. I think it's the damage they can do. We think there's mixed reports that a Ka-29 transport and combat helicopter might have been on board. It should have been on board. That's what they routinely carry. And there are reports that one of those went down with the ship. This is one of these. It's a coaxial helicopter, so it hasn't got a tail rotor. It's got two main rotors going in different directions to counterbalance whatever it is, Newton's second law or what have you. So smaller. The point I'm making is a small helicopter. It doesn't have a big tail boom and can fit neatly on the back of a ship. Now then, Andrei Yermak, who's President Zelensky's chief of staff, he said on Telegram, the Russian Black Sea Fleet is a symbol of occupation. It cannot be in Ukrainian Crimea. There is footage online. We've got it on our website at the moment. It is less clear, a bit fuzzy, a bit more edited, if you like, a bit broken up. It's less clear than in recent Ukrainian maritime drone strikes against the Black Sea Fleet. Although hearing myself say that line, I think we should put that under the heading of nice problem to have. But the footage does show at least two strikes, very large explosions. You see rounds coming off the ship, firing at something. You see tracer coming out at something, but it's firing far too high to hit any maritime drones unless they were going for air drones, but I don't think there's any reports of that. So there's rounds coming off the ship, and then there's a massive explosion. Andrei Yusov, who's a spokesperson for the HUR, that's Ukraine's military intelligence department, speaking to Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, said Russian forces were planning to place an anti-aircraft missile system on the Sergei Kotov. Not sure how you might know that, but it seems very plausible. Now, regarding the vessel's crew, Andrei Yusov said there are killed and wounded, but there is a possibility that some of the crew managed to evacuate. A crew of, I think, about 80 on one of those, I believe, that kind of order of magnitude. Now then, in total, Russia's Black Sea Fleet had 4 vessels of this design. The Sergei Kotov was previously hit by naval drones, along with another ship of the class, the Vasily Baikov. That was in September last year. Russian Defense Ministry said at the time that those vessels managed to repel the attack. So Mr. Yusov said, the fewer such ships that there are, the fewer air defense systems can be placed on them, presenting more opportunities for Ukrainian forces. So, I mean, yes, it's good to go around sinking these sort of ships if you're in the Ukrainian armed forces, but I don't think they're just doing it willy-nilly, as much fun as that would be. I think, look at what's been happening in the air recently, the A-50s that have been brought down. I think this is a coordinated attempt to deny Russia freedom of use of the air. You use the air, but it can come at extreme cost. And I think just, again, shows that this war is not in stalemate. The lines might not be moving very far, but there's a lot more to war than just what's happening on the ground. Speaking of what's happening on the ground, though, geolocated footage from the Institute for the Study of War, the US-based think tank, show Russia has been moving west of Bakhmut, now about 5 k's west of the city in inverted commas, what's left of it. Other geolocated footage show limited Russian gains across much of the front in the east, limited by a few hundred meters, but all seemingly going in the direction Russia would want. Now, the ISW say that the geolocated footage published yesterday shows elements of the Russian 155th Naval Infantry Brigade, part of the Pacific Fleet. It shows that they've advanced into central Novomykolaiv. That's 20 k's southwest of Donetsk city. So Russian forces continue to push on in the face of difficult Ukrainian defence with the shell shortage that we've been speaking of for some time. Elsewhere, Ukraine carried out an attack on an oil depot in a Russian border region. So this is a Ukrainian military intelligence source speaking to AFP earlier today. This is the latest in a string of such attacks. The source confirmed reports in the local media that a Ukrainian drone had struck an oil facility in the Russian village of Dolgoya, about 100 k's directly or due north of Kharkiv in the border region. Fuel tanks and storage tanks were set ablaze. Russia separately claimed its air defences had shot down 3 drones over Belgorod Oblast overnight last night and 1 over Kursk. And that came out of the Russian Defence Ministry's Telegram channel. I don't know if what they were reporting was part of the wave of attacks that hit the oil depots. Now then, on to the political update on this German intelligence leak, which the ramifications rumble on. And I'll ask Latika her views on that in a little bit. But so today, Germany's Defence Minister Boris Pistorius, speaking earlier today, he said that one of the participants on the call had dialed in via a non-secure line and that disciplinary measures were being looked into. Now, Pistorius also said that Russia had likely intercepted the military call via widespread surveillance rather than a spy or a targeted surveillance. I'll come back to that in a moment. He said the use of WebEx for the call was authorised, and Germany would take technical and organisational measures to ensure such an incident would not happen again. He said he had telephoned allies over the leak and received the assurance that their confidence in Berlin was intact. Mr. Pistorius said, "Trust in Germany is unbroken. Everyone knows about the danger of such wiretapping attacks and know that no one can offer 100% protection." Now, I have questions, Mr. Pistorius. I don't disagree. People who know more about these things than I do have assured me it's technically easy to hack the kit they were using, but how did Russia know that call was happening at that time and for them to have a go? Berlin's former intelligence chief, speaking last night, he said that the leak could be the tip of the iceberg. So this is August Hanning. He said that more NATO secrets may have been compromised. I mean, may, doing a lot of heavy lifting here in this sentence, but may have been compromised after the leak. He was speaking to Bild newspaper. He said the leak could have been just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, for my money, I mentioned it briefly yesterday, but a 38-minute call, which a very small portion was leaked, causing widespread embarrassment, and rightly so, widespread embarrassment. But I think, and I've been speaking to some folks in the Whitehall community here, I just think that if more had been given away in that 38 minutes that was of use to Russia, they would have kept their powder dry. They would have kept quiet, because you can bet your bottom dollar that Germany is now going over everything that was said in that call with a fine-tooth comb. And they're shutting down if there's any possible leak about any other sensitive material or programs, projects, plans, policy, blah, 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 they'll be shutting those down or taking mitigation action. So Russia must have looked at that. And if they've leaked this to get the jollies, and yet there was other gold that could have come out of it that's now denied to them because Germany are taking active measures to shut it down, then Russia will be kicking themselves and saying that they've missed an opportunity. And they are many cruel and inhuman people there, but they're not stupid. So I don't think that there was much more in that 38-minute call for Russia to have gained. I think it was probably a conversation that could have happened at the British equivalent of official level. So you can have that over insecure means because you're just talking about routine stuff. I think the conversation has strayed above the line, above the secret and maybe the TS line, and the people on the call realise that and then sort of shut it down. You remember that daft comment one of them made saying, "Ho, ho, ho, imagine if the media got hold of this call." It's like, forget about the media, mate. Start with bloody Russia. So I think they've strayed over the line, but I think the vast majority of it was probably really boring stuff And that's why Russia thought that the best they can get out of this was a nice, embarrassing hack and leak. But that's just the views from Dom. More views are available, one of which you'll get very shortly, I'm sure. Just to finish this off with, Boris Pistorius speaking this morning, that talk about a disciplinary action might be taken, and is this the end of the head of the Luftwaffe is going to lose his job? Boris Pistorius, pretty good. He's come out supporting his people. He said, if something worse doesn't come out, I certainly won't sacrifice my best officers for Putin's games. I mean, that's not bad leadership right there, saying, okay, you've cocked it up, but I'm going to stand up for you, and I'm going to come out publicly and say that. So I thought that was pretty good form by old Boris. Not that one, the other one. Okay, next one. Now, Czech television have reported French President Emmanuel Macron. He arrived in Prague earlier today to meet Czech President Petr Pavel and the Prime Minister Petr Fiala. They're going to discuss plans to purchase ammunition for Ukraine outside of Europe, among other topics, obviously. You may remember Petr Pavel said last month at the Munich Security Conference that Prague had identified 500,000 155mm shells and a similar number of 122mm rockets available for purchase abroad. Mr. Pavel had said the ammunition could be shipped to Ukraine quickly if financing was found. That kicked off a load of soul searching. The Kyiv Independent saying today that several countries have supported this initiative: Canada, Belgium, Netherlands, Lithuania. Mr. Macron, speaking this morning, said, "We are surely approaching a moment for Europe in which it will be necessary not to be cowards. War has returned to our land." Bold stuff. Let's see the actions to back it up. Connected to that, I note today the European Commission has proposed ways to boost the European defence industry and shift it to what they call a war economy mode. European Commissioner for Internal Market Thierry Breton has presented specific proposal to the bloc's members to jointly buy from European arms companies and increase the production capacities of firms. Monsieur Breton said, "We need to change the paradigm and move into war economy mode. This also means that the European defence industry must take more risks with our support." Interesting. "In the current geopolitical context, Europe must take greater responsibility for its own security, regardless of the outcome of our allies' elections every 4 years." Clearly a nod there to the upcoming election in most notably the US. Now, the European Commission today has proposed a new €1.5 billion defence industry programme financed from the European Union budget from 2025 to 27. This new programme is going to invite EU member states to procure at least 40% of their defence equipment collectively by 2030, the EU Commission said in a statement. So that'll get the EU army buffs in a froth. But I think if there's a pot of money and a will to do something with it, that's a good start. The Commission also proposed to use a share of the profits made on frozen Russian assets to fund arms purchases for Ukraine, a point we've been talking about for quite some time. It's very tricky to sell yachts and hotels and all the rest of it. But grabbing the interest on the frozen assets is a lot easier. It's just a financial transfer that even if you get it wrong and it's overturned in years to come, it's just a cash transaction. So go for the money, the interest on the frozen assets. That's probably the easier way to do it. Right. Everybody, including me, has heard enough of me right now. So I'm delighted to be joined by journalist and author Latika Bourke, formerly of the Sydney Morning Herald, among others. Latika, I want to take the temperature of Australia and hear more in a moment about the Putin fascination syndrome, as you describe it. First, though, any thoughts on the German hack and leak? And Australia used to say it was the biggest non-NATO supporter of Ukraine, but now says it is one of them. What's changed? And welcome, Latika.
G'day, Dom. It's great to be on Ukraine the Latest, a podcast I've been listening to devoutly for the best part of a year, maybe more. So it's great to be here. And it's a wonderful resource. To answer the second question, I guess we could simply say an election happened. And I don't want to come on here and be political about this, but it is the case that before the change of government to a Labor government in May 2022, Australia used to proudly say it was the largest non-NATO contributor to the war effort in Ukraine. Now the government's language is we're one of the largest non-NATO contributors. Actually, we've slipped down to 6th place. And if you look at the Kiel Institute's register, we are contributing 0.034% of GDP on military support. Overall support, it takes us up to about 0.40% of our GDP. That's a rank of 31. Now, there's smaller countries that are doing more than what Australia is. So this has been an ongoing slippage in Australia for its support. And this is despite the government of the day saying very clearly and loudly with one hand, we will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes. We're doing all we can. But actually, and I know we'll discuss this piece by piece, when you look at what Ukraine has asked for and what Australia gives, there's a very big gap.
Now, what Australia has and what it gives, that is a very interesting question. I want to ask you about your interview with the former Prime Minister Tony Abbott in a moment, but just on this subject, recently there's been a whole spat about Australia burying its old Taipan, NH-90, I think, the transport helicopters, literally getting rid of them, smashing them up and burying them. There was the issue over the Bushmaster armed personnel carriers. Why is there a reluctance in the current Labour administration? Or maybe it goes broader than that. What is it about support for Ukraine that means that these things are happening?
So, Dom, you're referring there to the Taipan helicopters. Now, we had a crash that killed some military personnel involving these Taipans. So they were going to be retired anyway. The Australian government and Defence decided to retire them a bit earlier. But what went missing in this decision was, hang about, there's a country that's fighting a war. Could they make any use of this kit, even if it's not necessarily flying the helicopters? Could they strip them for parts? Could they use the equipment? At no point did anyone in the defence bureaucracy be proactive about that. At no point did anyone in the Australian government get proactive about that. And Ukraine did come in and ask, hang on, we'll take those helicopters from you if you're getting rid of them. By the time that had happened, it had already taken place that they were being destroyed, dismantled and buried. Now, that set off a pretty big row in Australia amongst the right people. And there is now a kind of argument or a campaign to have Defence think a little more clearly and a little more proactively about kit that we're retiring. What could we make use of? What could Ukraine make use of? It follows a similar battle that we had over some vehicles called Hawkeyes. Now, Ukraine wanted these vehicles because they're very good at getting around and transporting injured people around and things like this. And we had trouble with the braking system in Australia. So we all know that Ukrainians are excellent at engineering. And the Ukrainians said, hey, we'll take them off you. And guess what? We'll probably be able to fix that braking system for you. For reasons that no one has really clearly explained, Australia refused to give Ukraine those vehicles. Now, that's not to say Australia has not done a lot for Ukraine. We have given Bushmasters, for instance. That's been a real jewel in the crown, and they've been very warmly received by Ukraine. And in fact, one of the ironic things to consider here, Dom, is nobody has done more to advertise the Australian Bushmaster, which is produced in Victoria, as a piece of warfighting equipment than Ukraine. President Zelensky spent about a year asking for these Bushmasters, and every time that word came out of his mouth, that was a huge advertising boom for these pieces of kit. And the last time we gave Ukraine Bushmasters, I think, was around July last year. That was around NATO. The government was already in Australia going wobbly over giving them more of these Bushmasters. And there was one incident before July last year where they actually kind of went to the garage and got the scrapyard heap vehicles that were Vietnam era and gave those to Ukraine instead. So it's been a really sad and puzzling journey because, Dom, the support amongst the Australian community does not match this disinterested support that we're seeing at the very top echelons of both defence and the Australian government. Yeah, and just before we turn to your interview with Tony Abbott, I keep saying that, sorry, but I just keep thinking of another question. We were chatting before about AUKUS, the Australia, UK, US. It's a science and technology and hard military capability
agreement. The most notable outcome so far has been the plans for nuclear submarines, but it does extend much further than that into intelligence sharing and science and tech and what have you, research and so on, blah, blah, blah. But at the moment, it's kind of, it's submarines replacing the current Collins class, I think, Australian subs with, I think the plan at the moment is you're going to get a US Virginia class as a stopgap, then US and UK nuclear hunter-killers, so not the big bombers, but the hunter-killer subs are going to be in and out of Australian ports. And then the next generation of hunter-killer is going to be, whatever it's going to be called, but it's kind of SSN AUKUS, is going to be a shared platform, UK, Australia, possibly US, shared crews. But you were telling me that AUKUS is not brilliantly well supported by the current administration. They're sort of a little bit wary. So can you talk us through why that might be?
AUKUS does enjoy bipartisan support, but what is really important to appreciate, and this does actually interplay into support for Ukraine, and it's really important to understand this. So AUKUS was negotiated by the former coalition government, a centre-right government. Now, at the time, national security is such in Australia, you have to have bipartisan support for these big-ticket items, and the Labor Party completely locked in behind AUKUS. In government, the Labor Party has said, yes, we are rock solid on AUKUS. We'll see this through and we're doing everything we can. And they have. They have continued to sign up to AUKUS and AUKUS is proceeding. But what is different is that the Labor base and its supporters, and we've seen this particularly in some really prominent former Labor leaders, for example, Paul Keating, a former Labor Prime Minister, is one of these, have come out very much in criticism of AUKUS for several reasons. One is they say we are being way too provocative in terms of China. We don't need to provoke China in this way. The second is we're ceding our sovereignty to the United States. So forevermore, our defence capability will be locked into the United States. The United States is proving itself to be a fairly erratic ally at the moment. Do we really want to go all in with this sort of country? By the way, the answer in the community to most of that is yes, we do. Where that has come into effect, and this was explained to me by a cabinet minister actually, after that last round of Ukraine funding when they were giving them Vietnam-era vehicles, I rang a cabinet minister and said, look, what happened? What on earth happened? Where was the defence minister? And this minister explained to me that, the defence minister has had to spend a lot of chips defending AUKUS to our base. And so to get them over the line, there's not a lot of capacity and there's not a lot of room left to now have another argument with them about continuing to support Ukraine. That dynamic wouldn't have existed under the former government. I don't think that dynamic would exist in the UK, even if there's a change of government to Labor here. But it does a little for the Labor Party. Now, the Labor Party had a conference last year where they had to go in and defend AUKUS to their own base against a motion that was put up. And they did brilliantly. The government, to its full credit, did a smashing job in convincing its own members to support AUKUS. But again, that's just an argument that the former government wouldn't even have had to have.
I just would now like to turn to your recent interview with former Prime Minister Tony Abbott, fairly outspoken and freed of the shackles of office. He was able to perhaps be a bit freer. Talks about him, the position he is in now and what influence he's able to have. It's all very well being unshackled and able to have your opinion when you're no longer in office, but hey, you're no longer in office, so is he still a voice to be listened to? And tell me about what he's calling the Putin fascination syndrome, please.
Sure, Dom. So Tony Abbott was Prime Minister between 2013 and 2015. We went through Prime Ministers pretty quick during this phase of history. And I was a political reporter in the Canberra Press Gallery, what you would call the lobby here in the UK at this time. So I know Tony pretty well. He is very much a right-wing warrior, conservative warrior, very controversial figure in Australia. And many would say he took Australian politics and certainly the Liberal Party in Australia to the conservative right. We park that because what happened during his tenure was that MH17 went down. And this was, I think, a very defining moment for his premiership. And when that plane went down, Australia was a temporary member on the UNSC. We used that position to go in and actually succeed in passing a resolution against that. We were able to obtain and negotiate access to the crash site. And this really scarred Australia because we lost 38 Australian citizens and residents, including a beautiful little family of kids in Perth, and it was really heartbreaking for the nation. And so Russia intruded into Australian life in a way you might not expect since 2014. And so actually the war in Ukraine resonates a lot more strongly than you might expect for a country like Australia, which is so far away. So Tony Abbott has always been very passionate in supporting Ukraine. He has always been a critic of Vladimir Putin. And in fact, in a very Tony Abbott way, he threatened very famously to shirt front Mr. Putin when he would meet him at the G20. And this is an AFL term. I don't really watch AFL, but it's a pretty biff game. And a shirt front, I understand, is a fairly aggressive way of knocking someone out. So he did make this threat to, kind of obviously he's not going to physically take on Putin, but that's the level of care and concern he had. He wanted to confront Vladimir Putin. Now, fast forward a little, and Tony Abbott is now out of office. He is one of many prime ministers in Australia that exists, but he has devoted a lot of his more recent time to try and appeal to the GOP, his right-wing brothers in the United States. And some of the arguments that I have heard on the grapevine that he's been making behind closed doors have been saying to the Americans, look, if you want this world order and if you want to face off on China, you need to accept the responsibilities that come with being the superpower. That doesn't mean being isolationist, and it certainly doesn't mean abandoning Kyiv. Now, I've heard to different degrees he's making those arguments depending on his audience, but we did see this stray into the public domain last year when he was at the Wall Street Journal's CEO Council, and he stood up and asked Mike Johnson, the House Speaker, and said, please don't let Christmas pass without approving new aid for Ukraine. Now, we all know how that's ended. The aid is still not passed. So I ran into Tony last week when I was in New Delhi at the Raisina Dialogue, and I said, hey, look, I hear you've been doing a lot of this work, and good on you for having a word with Mike Johnson, not that he listened to you. Would you do an interview? And he agreed, which is quite rare. He doesn't really give a lot of interviews these days. But I asked him what he made of the GOP and why, more importantly, he thought they would be on the precipice of potentially abandoning Ukraine. And without naming any names, he did go into this theory that he has that because some conservatives in the United States think Putin is a bit of a political ally, and they think that because Putin purports to stand for Orthodox Christianity, he is against some of the things that, to use Tony Abbott's word, woke world is against, so particularly when that comes to LGBTQ issues. And so they've seen an association that's there. But Abbott was very strong with me. He said, look, no true conservative murders their political opponents. Speaking, of course, of Alexei Navalny. He says no political conservative invades and bullies their neighbours. No person acts the way Putin's been acting for 20-odd years now. And he said, one of the baffling things that I'm yet to understand is that on the left we've had this Trump derangement syndrome, but on the right we seem to have this Putin fascination syndrome. And I thought that was a really apt and accurate way of assessing it. And I also thought, Dom, that does go to show just how differently the right wings around the world, in the Western world particularly, are thinking about security, are thinking about the global order, and are thinking about what happens if America does abandon its post here.
So if he's identified the problem there, Putin fascination syndrome, did he have any answers or any sort of way ahead, what we should look out for?
Well, I think from certainly an Australian perspective, and you see the Europeans making this argument too, it is understood that the Americans, particularly the GOP, care a lot about China and want to stop China becoming a superpower to topple or displace America from its role. Now, I asked Tony about that, and he said he also finds this argument completely unconvincing. This is the argument run that the United States must withdraw from the European front so that they can focus with greater attention all their resources on the Indo-Pacific and on China. But Abbott said to me, look, this same instinct, and he didn't identify it as such in the interview, but he is talking about isolationism, which is clearly rampant in the GOP. He said this is the same instinct that if they abandon Ukraine, will have them abandon Taiwan too. So he doesn't believe the credibility of that argument that they're interested in preserving a world order or a security sense. It's just in a different domain. He thinks they're willing to give up altogether. And of course, he strongly disagrees with that.
I mean, that's fascinating. And it takes me on to my last question, if I may. And I think it might have to be my last question because I'm all fingers and thumbs here. I'll keep forgetting to unmute. But I don't understand why it is so difficult in the Australian context or in Australian politics to link what is happening in Ukraine, the bigger picture, the trampling over international law, might is right, all the rest of it, to China's ambitions in Australia's neck of the woods. It's the very, very similar arguments. And if Putin is seen to fail, made to fail in Ukraine, then that may give President Xi pause for thought in his area. If Putin wins, then by God, there's going to be nothing to stop China. I don't understand why that's a more difficult argument to make.
Well, I don't think it has to be, but what we are seeing is a government that's gone missing in action when it comes to providing that sort of leadership. And two little examples display this. We have still not reopened our embassy in Kyiv. Can you believe that? All our allies have. We used to share the premises with the Canadians. We're still not back. To mark the 1-year anniversary of the full-scale invasion, President Zelensky was asked whether he'd like to see the Australians return their diplomatic posting. And he said, yes, and please bring your ambassador back on one more Bushmaster, please. A great quote, right, showing his excellent communication skills. Still, the government is ignoring President Zelensky. So what you have in Australia is a dynamic where Zelensky is somebody that can be ignored despite everything that Ukraine is doing to fight for freedom. The second example is Ukraine has asked for a second time for some humanitarian coal. This is to keep them warm over the winter. We know that Putin is attacking their energy infrastructure deliberately. We also know that's a war crime when it's far away from the front lines. The Australian government has rejected this, and the Prime Minister was asked about this 3 days ago, and he said, well, what we've done is we've given them $50 million. They can choose to spend that on energy or weapons, however they want, and our coal goes to China and India. There's countries a lot closer to Ukraine where they can get their coal. Now, I was staggered to hear that answer. That is essentially saying our coal is for profit for sale to India and China. By the way, Australia signed a free trade agreement with the United Kingdom. If we're about to run an argument that goods are too far to be shipped to Ukraine, then goods are too far to be shipped around the world to this wonderful country, Dom. So why is this argument not landing? Well, I think one is political will. That's just gone missing in Australia, which is a huge shame and a huge pity. The second is defence bureaucracy is not doing what it could. It has no political imagination, and there's a long history of defence brass in Australia outliving their ministers. We've also seen the defence minister in the Australian cabinet lose a lot of, influence in the composition of that government. At the societal level, I do think those messages still land, they do resonate, and the Australians do understand that an emboldened Putin could mean an emboldened China. That might manifest itself in very different ways, but it would have huge implications for the Australian economy. If, for example, China were to move on Taiwan, the UK former Foreign Secretary James Cleverly has said this, it would not only take down Taiwan's economy, it would take down China's and several others that are dependent on it. Well, guess what, Dom? Australia is dependent on the Chinese economy. 1/3 of our tax receipts come from China. We sell most of our iron ore to China. We're on the cusp of a lithium boom. Guess where we sell most of that lithium? To China. So Australians have a huge stake in preserving global trading conditions, ensuring that sea and freedom of navigation lanes are open, and ensuring that smaller countries don't get bullied against their will. They do understand that. I am very disappointed that the Australian government does not seem to be interested in prosecuting this argument as much as it could and should be.
And you've got over the trade spat. You're now able to sell your wine again to China. Is that all over? What was that about? Just remind me what kicked all that off? Can't remember.
That's a really good question because that also does, I think, feed into what's happened with Ukraine. So during the pandemic, Australia, the former government, asked for an inquiry into the origins of COVID-19. Now, this was a government that took an extremely hawkish view on China. When that happened, China reacted very, very badly. They imposed very suddenly and without warning enormous tariffs on Australian goods. This was on barley, 80% worth of tariffs worth 212% on some Australian wine. And that was imposed on a range of other things like coal and lobster and barley and some other goods. Now, the new government came in and said, our mission is to stabilise the relationship with China. To give you an indication of how bad things had gotten with our biggest trading partner, nobody in China would pick up the phone. Under the former government, they did not have any sort of formal communications with the Chinese government for years. China just refused to pick up the phone. So it was the Labor government's intention to come into power and stabilise this relationship and see those tariffs lifted. Now, under the former government, we began WTO proceedings because, of course, we believe and still strongly believe as a country that those actions were against world trading rules. And just before those cases, at least one of them on barley was about to be given a preliminary finding upon, we went to, actually the Chinese asked Australia, hey, just before this finding comes down, could you give us a few months reprieve and we'll have another look at whether we want to keep these tariffs on. A couple of months later, those tariffs on barley were lifted. Now the same procedure is happening for wine, and actually the Australian government's hopeful that this month those tariffs will be lifted. But what has crept into that debate was before the election, it was very much the view that China economically coerced Australia because the Australian government presented a political opinion China did not like. And there's nothing that anybody should ever do to try and suppress Australian opinion and use their economic trading might to do that. So that was a kind of bipartisan view. It was a very strongly held view in the society. What we have seen the Labor government start to do now is say, look at us, we've got a visit to Beijing. We're back in town with China. We're getting all these tariffs lifted. Our trade has actually increased now since the pandemic, two-way trade with China. And that's something that the government says at the same time, we're trying to diversify our trading relationships, but also, hey, look, the bounties are back in and we're about to get these tariffs lifted. So there is a big shade of difference there. Substantively, our security posture is the same. Things like AUKUS, things like our defence, those things will never change regardless of who's in power. But the narrative and the conversation is changing a little.
And just finally on this, I was talking the other day about where intelligence or analysis of information or leading to intelligence can go wrong, and you can get the two biggest failures are in confirmation bias, when you just see that everything fits the argument that you want to make, and availability bias, where you only pick the things that meet the argument that you want to make. So I don't want to fall foul of either of those things, but I ask you, so we keep trying to work out what China is offering Russia in the war in Ukraine. There is some material, some weapons, not a huge amount, not as much as they could do if they really wanted to jump all in. But I wonder if on the diplomatic side, if Russia said to China, we want you to work diplomatically to get Australia, New Zealand and the others out of this support for Ukraine. If that was happening, and again, I'm not trying to lean into the availability bias here, but can you see indications of China using its economic and diplomatic heft to try and cleave, or one of the consequences of which would be to move Australia away from such full-throated support for Ukraine as it has been in the past? Or am I overblowing that?
I don't think you're overblowing it as such. I wouldn't say it would be as necessarily blatant as that. And I think what you can already see is that subtle shift starting to happen. And there's been quite a few examples over recent years where Australia has just not come out and sign the same level of statements or condemnations. It took us a long time to introduce Magnitsky sanctions, for example. It took us even longer to then use them. Things like this are more corrosive, I think, to the greater alliance. The other thing I would say that Australia has huge amounts to worry about if indeed the US does withdraw from Ukraine, because that would divert Europe's attention to doubling down on its own security. We would see the US potentially boycott that stage and maybe even the Indo-Pacific, I don't know. But then where would that leave Australia? Its allies would be weakened and adrift. Australia's foreign policy at the moment, in my view, I think it's a very feet-up foreign policy. It's happy to coast, it's happy to drift. There's a perception, I think, that still exists in Europe that Australia is a very tough and muscular country when it comes to China. That's a reputation, I think, that was put onto the world stage by the actions of the former government, but the current government is actually still benefiting from this perception. And Annalena Baerbock, the German foreign minister, gave a speech to Australia quite a few months ago, and she was really congratulating the government for their tough stance against China. I don't think she quite appreciated the nuance that I explained to you just earlier about how this government is actually dealing with those economic coercion questions just a little bit differently. So I don't think you would get to a sense, Dom, where China would come to Australia and say, we want you to do this and you must. Although at the height of when our relationship was terrible, the Chinese ambassador did present to an Australian journalist a list of so-called 14 demands. And one of these 14 demands was they are very, very angry that Australia, in their view, was seen to be carrying out the security policies of the United States in the Indo-Pacific. And one example of this was Australia banning Huawei, the Chinese telecommunications vendor, from its national broadband network and then 5G. And eventually Britain also fell into line on that. The United States also banned Huawei and ZTE from 5G, but I think we were the first jurisdiction to do it. And the Chinese were very, very angry with Australia and did actually present a list via the media saying, these are our 14 demands that you can enjoy a good relationship with you if you just abide to these things. Now, of course, that would be ceding our sovereignty to China, and we said no way. And to their credit, the Australian Labor government also says no way. We've just hosted the ASEAN summit in Melbourne, and the Foreign Minister Penny Wong has again been very strong about the region not being dominated or bullied by any one partner. And of course, she is talking about China there.
Thanks, Latiga. Fascinating stuff. I'm going to move towards the end now. We always invite our guests to have the final thought. I'll just say for my final thought that we're expecting David back in tomorrow, so don't worry. The grown-ups are coming back. All will be better tomorrow. Latiga, any final thoughts? And I would just invite you as well to just offer any thoughts, as we were chatting before we started here, about this the Germany leak, because you had a slightly different view than I did. But that and any final thoughts, please.
Look, I do think the German leak is a problem for a different reason, because I think it came off the back of Scholz essentially admitting that Western troops would be required to operate some of these more sophisticated platforms and systems that have been already used, and thereby really dumping the British and the French in, I think. And I think this split in Europe is really concerning, given what we're already seeing in the United States. Where that leaves us all in another 9 or 10 months, I do worry about, because it's all very well for a country like Australia to hide under the doona. I think my friends laugh at me in England when I use that word, but I guess it's a British quilt. It's all very well for countries like Australia to use their geography and hide from the world's problems. Europe cannot afford to do this, and it does worry me, and you saw this, I think, reflected in the comments of the former Defence Secretary Ben Wallace about Germany's behaviour over recent weeks, that there is that fracturing, because, of course, that is what Putin has been depending upon, waiting for and hoping for.
Mark Hollingsworth is an author and journalist reporting on the war in Ukraine and Russia. David Nicholls spoke to Mark recently following his Telegraph article concerning the property empire in London owned by the Kremlin. Here's their conversation.
Mark, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for coming into the Telegraph offices and to our studio. Would you start just by introducing yourself and your work for our listeners?
Certainly. My name is Mark Hollingsworth. I'm a journalist and author. I wrote a book called Londongrad, From Russia with Cash, which is about the Russian oligarchs. And more recently, I wrote a book called Agents of Influence, which was a history of the KGB and drew parallels between what the KGB were doing during the Cold War and the current war in Ukraine. I'm also a freelance journalist, and I write a lot about Russia and Ukraine, mainly for The Spectator and the Daily Telegraph business news section, but I write for other papers, but Russia is certainly a special subject for me.
Well, let's start with your most recent article for The Telegraph, which you talk about the property empire owned by the Kremlin in London. Many listeners might be surprised by this, so can we just take some time and go through the basics? What is this empire, why do they buy it, and what do they use it for?
So what is not very well known is that the Russian state, the Kremlin, actually own a vast number of properties in London directly. If you do a public record land registry search on these addresses of these properties in central London, you'll find it actually states the ownership is the Russian Federation. And so I discovered these properties, there's about 15, 16 properties in central London, and the total value of these properties is at least £200 million sterling. And so, but when I put this to the Russian embassy in London and said, well, could you comment on these properties, that you own in London? And would you like to say any comment on the fact that they could be subject of legal action? And they said, well, they're all covered by diplomatic immunity, and so no legal action or political action could prevent or could take ownership away from these properties. And so that is certainly a sticking point. But the reason I wrote the article mainly, even though I had this original material, is that there was a ruling last week in the High Court in London, which basically stated that that one of the properties is actually a plot of land in Kensington in London. Could the ownership of that property, of that land, could be given to a third party in the right legal circumstances. So the background to this, and I think it is quite important and relevant, is that there's been a long-running lawsuit by the former shareholders of Nicholls Oil, which was Russia's biggest oil company. And the Russian state effectively nationalized this company, Nicholls Oil, and took it over without paying compensation to the shareholders many years ago. And there's been a long-running lawsuit by those shareholders who were not compensated for $50 billion. So they've been suing the Russian state as part of that. And the Russian state have been refusing, and they've been winning the cases, winning the litigation to get compensation, and winning all the cases in the courts. The Russian state has refused to pay any compensation. They refuse to pay. They refuse to accept the judgments, and the judgments have come down on the favour of these Nicholls Oil shareholders. So quite recently, the Nicholls Oil shareholders and their lawyers are owed close to £1 million pounds in legal fees, and the Russian state refused to pay. So you've got a situation where they're winning a huge lawsuit, and the other side, and there's a court ruling in London for the Russian state to pay these legal fees. So what they did is that they identified a plot of land in Kensington and West London, and went back to the judge in London in the High Court and said, we have a judgment against the Russian state. They are refusing to pay. We have identified an asset in London. Will you give us a charge, which basically means a claim, on this plot of land, which is worth many millions? And so the judge agreed. The Nicholls Oil shareholders and their lawyers now have a claim on this plot of land, which and now they've got until April to appeal. If their appeal is unsuccessful, then the Nicholls Oil investors, former Nicholls Oil shareholders, will take ownership of that plot of land. And we've got evidence to show that that plot of land is directly owned by the Russian state. So I know it's a very long-winded answer, but you need to know the context of all this, because there's two issues here. There's legal action against the Russian state. The Russian state will say, this is all covered by diplomatic immunity, you can't touch this. But now there's a legal precedent, which means that if the Russian state is liable and they've lost a case, then the judges in the UK are saying you can take ownership of that property even though it's covered by diplomatic immunity. So the implications are actually quite huge, because it throws out the whole issue of diplomatic immunity, and it creates an issue where there could be more legal action against the Russian state, and then you've got the whole issue of diplomatic immunity.
We'll get on to that. But before we do, what do we know about the properties owned by the Kremlin in London in terms of what they might be used to do? Do we have any sense of why the state has these buildings? What's the advantage of having them?
Well, historically, the Soviet Union during the Cold War and Russia since Putin took over, like any other nation state, they have an embassy in London, and they're allowed to have properties throughout London so that their diplomats and intelligence officers got somewhere to live, somewhere to work from. And that's perfectly normal. I mean, the US and the British and other countries obviously have embassies all over the world, and they have properties where their diplomats and intelligence officers live. So historically, they've always had those properties, and I identified a particular house on Holland Park in West London where KGB officers in the past have lived and been based. And so they still exist. They're still owned by the Russian Federation. The Russian Federation are claiming it's all covered, there's diplomats are living there. This is all perfectly normal. The reason it's become an issue is that some people in the Ukraine government and also anti-Russian campaigners and a whole range of lawyers and different activists are saying Putin and Russia have breached international law by invading Ukraine. They've committed huge atrocities, human rights abuses. Vast numbers of Ukrainian people have died in terms of civilians and families and children. This is a international illegal criminal act, and so in that circumstance, then there's an issue. There's an argument that some people are making of saying we have a legal right, we have certainly a moral right to take ownership of Russian state-owned assets abroad, which include mainly properties. So my article I've discovered that the properties in London owned by the Russian state, certainly the total value are at least 200 million sterling. So that theoretically, if the British government decided to go down that road of basically seizing or confiscating those properties, that would yield certainly 200 million, which could go to the Ukrainian war effort. But then we've got all kinds of legal and political ramifications of that, which we could go into, but I'm aware of your time.
Not at all. Let's do it. I mean, so far some of our listeners will be with us and they'll think there is a moral, and maybe we can make that sort of the legal case for taking these properties away from the ownership of the Russian Federation. But as we've discussed before we started recording, it's not quite as simple as that. What are the issues that would lie ahead if that was the road that the British state went down?
So there are two problems with the Russian, if the British or American government in America decide to take ownership of these properties. The first one is the revenge or the tit for tat, the response of the Russian government in Moscow. In other words, if the British government take ownership of these properties in London and take ownership and then sell them and take the money and use it for the war in Ukraine, the Russian government in Moscow may do the same thing. They may take ownership of British properties in Moscow, which are houses, diplomats, take ownership and throw them out, and take ownership and make money from that. So that is a problem in terms of what Russia will do in response. And I think the second problem is more, morally. There's obviously a case in terms of what the atrocities by Russia in Ukraine, but also I think you have to be a bit careful in terms of understanding the difference between the freezing of assets under the sanctions and confiscation. It's two separate things. Just because a Russian oligarch or property, the assets have been frozen, that doesn't necessarily mean that the British or American government have taken ownership of it. It just means the asset's been frozen. It just means that the Russian state or the oligarch cannot make money or sell that asset. But there's a difference between freezing an asset and confiscation. Confiscation is basically you taking ownership and being able to sell it. So I think legally, there's lawyers. Some lawyers are very unhappy about the confiscation route, because basically, the West is supporting Ukraine quite largely in the sense of supporting rule of law. and that the Russian invasion is illegal. And so if the British and American governments start confiscating assets and confiscating things, basically seizing properties and assets without due course throughout legal due course of action, then there's a sort of double standard there to some extent, and there's a tricky issue that we may be doing things that Putin is already doing. We're kind of repeating what he's doing in the sense of confiscating, seizing things, which is pretty much what the Russian state did with this Nicholls oil company, and they have done. The Russian state had taken ownership of companies purely for their own benefit without compensation. So I think that's also a problem.
You mentioned in your answer there the oligarchs, and there's sort of two strands, I think, in this conversation. And we've spoken about the properties owned by the state, by the Russian Federation, but of course in the 90s and 2000s, a large number of Russian oligarchs, by which we mean the sort of the super rich, usually men who run who run sort of vast enterprises spanning all sorts of different businesses, bought property in London and moved their livelihoods to London and spent money in London buying football clubs or what have you. Could you give us your take on this class of Russian oligarchs who came to London? Why did they come? How does their ownership of assets and property differ from the Kremlin's? And bring us up to date. Where are we now, sort of 30 years later?
Well, the situation with the Russian oligarchs moving to London is that it started soon after Putin became president in the year 2000, because they were warned by Putin that if you get involved in politics in Russia, the obvious example being Mikhail Khodorkovsky, that I'm going to come after you. This is what Putin said quite openly to the oligarchs. And they had most of them had made all their money in the 1990s when Yeltsin was president, and the Russian state sold off very valuable, very lucrative assets, oil and gas and energy assets, from being state-owned to the private sector, and the oligarchs bought these properties at a tiny proportion of what their real value was, and they made a lot of money very quickly in very dubious circumstances, and the Russian people and the Russian state were completely ripped off. Putin came in and said, you can keep your money, but stay out of politics. So the oligarchs decided, probably with good reason, that they needed to move their money, their wealth, out of Russia. And they weren't particularly interested in investing in Russia anyway, or investing in or giving money to charity. There was, a small group of oligarchs had billions and billions, and so they decided to move their money out of Russia and keep it safe. And so they laundered it through offshore companies and offshore trusts and offshore bank accounts via different jurisdictions, and it ended up being in London. And they chose London mainly because of the rule of law issue, in the sense that they knew, or their lawyers told them, look, if you register and keep your assets in London and your money in London, you'll be safe. Because when Putin, as he did, and the Russian state then went after the oligarchs in the sort of 2010 era, to say, you're a criminal, you've laundered money, you've not paid tax, we want to extradite you back from London to Russia, the oligarchs knew, or their advice was, don't worry, no British judge will extradite you back to Moscow. And the reason is because they knew, the judge ruled and knew that if they were sent back to Moscow, they would not get a fair trial. So it's a purely illegal thing. But also I think they knew or advised that the British state is the most compliant and complacent of all nation states in the Western world in terms of lack of regulation, lack of accountability. They wouldn't investigate them. They were basically safe, and so they felt that London was the most secure place to hide and park their assets and money. And also they enjoyed and they loved the atmosphere and the lifestyle as well.
What do you think that says about the British state? And how do we get into that position?
Well, I think it's a cultural thing with the British state in all aspects of very wealthy foreign individuals who move their money and assets into the UK, because they basically regard the UK as a soft touch. And often what happens is that oligarchs or very wealthy people from all parts of the world, it's not just Russia, believe or advise that the UK is a soft touch in terms of, you're not going to get investigated. If they went to Switzerland or France or Italy, there'd probably be an investigative magistrate onto them. There's a lot more scrutiny. And definitely in America, there's a lot more regulation. They'd have to disclose a lot more information if they moved their assets to America, for example. And the UK culturally is, as in a lot of things, and you could argue it's a sort of slightly odd parallel, but with, the post office scandal, for example, it's only when an ITV drama, it's only when there's an outrage do they suddenly do something. It was unbelievable miscarriage of justice, and so many things went wrong with that. But it took 20 years, and you often think, well, if that happened in America or Europe, there would have been a lot more aggressive. So we are, and in law enforcement as well, and in the intelligence as well, we're just basically too complacent, too laid back, and we only impose sanctions against these. We only took action against these Russian oligarchs when the war in Ukraine broke out, and they've been here for 20 years. So, that's an argument that a lot of people are saying, well, if these Russian oligarchs are so evil and you're sanctioning them and you're shutting them down, why didn't you do it 20 years ago, when it was known how they made their money?
And you have the poisoning of Alexander Litvinenko. You have numerous deaths, usually not investigated. You have the Salisbury poisonings. I mean, in my mind, that feels like the moment when the British state started to wake up, and would you say that and maybe the Ukraine invasion? Those are the two moments where you felt the narrative shift and the mood shift.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as you say, when Litvinenko was murdered in 2006, late 2006, and there'd been other murders as well, and also that from that moment, Putin became much more aggressive towards the West from that period anyway. And so then, the British state, the law enforcement agencies, intelligence, the government, started taking more scrutiny and getting much more involved. And they didn't really take that much action, but my information is that they definitely were taking it more seriously. Whereas before, they just saw it as, a bunch of wealthy foreigners moving their money to London. What's the big deal? Without understanding that, well, where's the money come from?
You mentioned there how you think it's changed since the start of the full-scale invasion in Ukraine. Could you talk a little bit more about that? How so? Do we still, the question is maybe, do you think we still live in Londongrad?
Well, I think since the outbreak of the Ukraine war, Londongrad doesn't exist. Mainly because most of the big-time Russian oligarchs, they've been sanctioned. And there's a whole debate about the way they've been sanctioned and on what criteria. And there's a problem there in terms of, some of the Russian oligarchs have nothing to do with Putin, and I think it's been quite, and I've written about this, even though I've written endless critical articles about the oligarchs, some of them, just was they have nothing to do with, in terms of, if you look at it legally, you've got to prove that their wealth is derived from contracts with the Kremlin and contracts with the Russian government. Many of them made their money, in the 1990s, long before Putin was on the scene, and so that's a whole separate discussion. But the reality is, nearly all the oligarchs have left, and they're living either back in Moscow or Israel. There's very little activity going on here. They're not here. They're not doing business. They're not operating. And, I think when the war ends, I'm not sure they're going to look for a different Londongrad, because it's all the infrastructure of their properties and bank accounts and companies has all been shut down.
In a way, that sounds like I don't know if it's a positive ending, but it's certainly potentially better than the situation you wrote about in your book. Is that fair?
Yeah. Obviously, The problem with the oligarchs is that their source of their wealth was very controversial, to say the least. They ripped off the Russian state, they ripped off the Russian people, and they paid virtually no tax. And it was just a huge, ostentatious, just orgy of spending to the benefit of nobody except themselves. And they laundered their proceeds, and it ended up here. And in effect, it was dirty money. So, I mean, I think the British government, and there's been evidence for this, really said, well, we don't want to touch them because it does provide revenue for the city, which is exaggerated. There was a famous occasion where a British government minister was walking into 10 Downing Street, and he had his briefcase and he had his notebook open. And it said his notes were some words to the effect of, "We don't want to, we're not going to touch the Russian money in London because it will upset the city or cause damage to the city." But the truth is, if those Russian oligarchs were evicted effectively, it would not damage the British economy or certain London hardly at all. And so now it is the end of Londongrad being a haven for Russian and dirty money, and most of them are either in Dubai or Israel or back in Moscow.
Mark, is there anything else you think we need to talk about, anything we might have missed that you'd like to go into more detail on for our listeners?
Well, I think the issue in Ukraine is if Trump is elected in the United States and he cuts off all the funding for Ukraine, the issue then is going to be how is Ukraine going to fund their defense? And so there's a big issue which is related to what I wrote about the ownership of Russian state-owned properties in London, which is certainly close to 200 million. But there's a whole issue about Russia's, I think there's something close to $300 billion worth of Russian assets in international banks, in the U.S. Federal Reserve banks, and I don't know the details, but I know that that's a matter of record, that they have assets close to 300 billion overseas, state assets. And so there have been moves by the U.S. government and officials and other people to confiscate that money if they need to. So then you've got a legal issue of how they're going to do it legally. And secondly, will Putin then respond and retaliate? And I think that's a major issue. And it's probably, in my opinion, the most important issue that faces Ukraine and the war is, if Trump is elected, how they're going to pay for the war, how they're going to fund their military operation. If they can't fund their military operation, in my opinion, it's all over. They're going to lose. But that's just my analysis.
Sometimes at the end of the interviews, when we talk about something which is a hypothetical like that is, we don't know what will happen, although I think we can make good guesses. I do ask, what do you think will happen? But maybe that's a silly question in this case, because we just don't know with somebody like Trump.
We just don't know. I mean, what's interesting is, obviously, the Ukraine have outperformed and surprised everyone by their resilience and intelligence and skill and bravery in withstanding the Russian invasion. But from what I read, and I don't have any particular insight, is that what seems to me is that they're particularly astute at using new technology. For example, the drones, which apparently only cost, I don't know the technical detail, but it's something like $200 for each drone or something, and they're apparently quite effective. And so I think that Ukraine has been quite ingenious in using military hardware to resist Russia. But at the end of the day, it's hard to believe that if the funding is cut off, we've got this huge Russian war machine, and Putin, I think, will probably recruit people, just the sheer force of numbers will then come in. And then Ukraine will run out of ammunition because they don't have the money, and then it could be all over. That's my simplistic analysis.
Mark, thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To support our work and to stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine Live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload, so if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. As the disinformation war ramps up, we are relying on your support more than ever. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X, formerly known as Twitter. You can find our handles in the description for the episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Giles Gear, Rachel Porter and Georgia Cohen. Executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.